The courtesy of rust. The sound of a life not lived is a profound and terrible silence. It is the low vibration of a refrigerator in an empty apartment, the whisper of air through a vent, the hollow spaces between the ticks of a clock. It is the sound of waiting. But waiting for what? An ending? Or merely a different kind of beginning? We tell ourselves we escape our pasts, that we leave our ghosts in the dust. We move to new cities. We find new jobs. We force new, sterile routines upon ourselves until the memories blur. But some ghosts are patient. Some ghosts understand that the most exquisite horror is not in the chase, but in the granting of a long, meaningless reprieve before the inevitable collection. Some ghosts are, in their own way, terribly kind. The hiss of the radiator was the only companion Leo kept. It was a faithful sound, a constant low-pressure sigh that filled the sterile white box he called his apartment. He had lived here for 7 years, 7 years since the rust and the screaming. 7 years since he had left Marco in that decaying place. The doctors called it PTSD. They gave him pills that sanded the edges off his thoughts, leaving him dull and functional. He worked from home, a data entry job that required nothing from him but the rhythmic, hypnotic click-clack of his keyboard, a sound that almost, but never quite, drowned out the other sounds he remembered. Tonight, the radiator's hiss felt different. It sounded less like steam and more like a whisper, a dry, sibilant breath dragging through the pipes. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his fingers freezing over the keys. "It's the building," he muttered into the quiet of the room, the words sounding loud and foreign. "It's an old building. That's all." He'd been telling himself things like that for 2,555 days. He'd counted them at first, a morbid penance. Each day he woke up was a day Marco did not. He had survived. Marco had not. The question of why coiled in the base of his skull, a serpent in the dark. Marco had been the brave one, the one who laughed at the creaks and groans of dying buildings, who saw beauty in the peel of lead paint and the skeletal remains of forgotten industry. They were urban explorers, ruin chasers they'd called themselves, seeking the poetry in decay, until they found it. The place had been an old children's infirmary on the outskirts of town, a place whispered about in local lore. The kind of place that had a name, the Tattler, because it was said the walls would whisper the sins of anyone who walked its halls. Marco had laughed, the sound echoing a little too long in the cavernous, debris-strewn lobby. "Don't worry, Leo." He'd grinned, his flashlight beam dancing across a mural of grotesquely cheerful cartoon animals, their paint blistered and weeping. "My conscience is clear." Leo's wasn't. He had been terrified from the moment the sole of his boot made a wet, sucking sound on the black molded linoleum. An oppressive weight hung in the air, thick with the scent of rust and damp and something else. Something metallic and sweet, like old blood. The silence in that place was a living thing, broken only by their footsteps and the frantic, papery beat of a trapped bird's wings somewhere deep within. They were looking for the Whispering Ward, the place where the most disturbed children were supposedly kept. The legend said you could still hear them. As they went deeper, the air grew colder, and a new sound began to weave itself into the silence. It was a faint, dry, scraping noise, a rustling, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. But there were no leaves, only shattered glass and plaster dust. "You hear that?" Leo had whispered, his voice tight. Marco paused, head cocked. The scraping stopped. "It's just rats, man. Big ones, probably." But the confidence in his voice had developed a hairline crack. The sound started again as they reached the ward, a long hallway of small rooms with heavy, windowless doors. The scraping was closer now, inside one of the rooms. It was rhythmic, methodical. The sound of a single gnarled finger dragging slowly, deliberately, down a rusted metal door. A long, screeching scrape, then a pause, then another. Marco, ever the fool, had crept toward the door. He'd put his ear to the cold metal, a slow grin spreading across his face. He turned back to Leo, his eyes wide with a performer's thrill, and mouthed the words, "It's real." Then the scraping stopped, and from the other side of the door came a single, sharp, metallic tap. Then another. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a rat. It was a knock. What happened next was a kaleidoscope of noise and panic. The door hadn't opened. It had buckled inward. The sound a deafening metallic shriek, a single thunderclap of tearing steel. Marco had screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound that was cut off with a wet, final choke. Leo hadn't stayed to see what emerged. He had turned and run, the sound of his own ragged gasps and pounding heart drowning out everything else. He fled through the decaying halls, through the lobby, and burst out into the clean, cold night air, never once looking back. He had survived. Marco had not. The police found Marco's car. They found the infirmary. They found no sign of forced entry into that ward, and no sign of Marco at all. Now, 7 years later, the Radiator hissed his name. Leo. He shot up from his chair, a cold dread washing over him. It wasn't the building. It wasn't his mind. He was not alone. The quiet hum of his apartment had become a held breath. He backed away from his desk, his eyes darting around the small room. The window was locked. The door was deadbolted. He was safe. He was just tired, stressed. He needed his pills. He kept a small box of mementos from his life before, the life that included Marco. He rarely opened it, but tonight, a morbid compulsion took him. He needed to touch something from that time, to prove it had been real, that he wasn't just a collection of frayed nerve endings in a white room. He knelt and pulled the dusty cardboard box from under his bed. The scent of aging paper and dried flowers rose to meet him. He rummaged past old concert tickets and faded photographs until his fingers brushed against a stack of Polaroids from their final trip. He'd forgotten they even existed. He flipped through them. There was the photo of the infirmary's gates, twisted and menacing, a shot of the lobby, the cartoon animals looking like leering demons in the flash, a picture of Marco, grinning like an idiot, pointing at a collapsed ceiling. Then he got to the last one. A photo Marco had taken of him. Leo was standing at the entrance to the whispering ward, his face pale, his posture tense. He was looking back at the camera, not smiling. But it wasn't his own fearful face that made the air leave his lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. It was the figure behind him. Standing in the deep shadow of a doorway just over his shoulder was a third person. It was tall and painfully thin, its form indistinct, blurred by the shadows and the cheapness of the camera's flash. But it was undeniably there. Its long skeletal arms hung limply at its sides. But the worst part, the part that made Leo's stomach turn to ice, was its face. Though most of it was lost to the gloom, a wide ear-to-ear smile was starkly visible. It was a smile of predatory, patient amusement. It was the smile of something that was enjoying a private joke. It was looking right at Marco. A sudden sharp tap echoed from his apartment door. Tap, tap, tap. Leo didn't breathe. It couldn't be. He was on the 4th floor. There was no one in the hall. He knew that with an unshakable certainty. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, the sound of hard bone against wood. Leo scrambled backwards, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He finally understood. The creature in the photo, the thing in the ward. It had been real. It had been there the whole time. He hadn't escaped. He'd been let go. It had taken Marco and it had let him run. It had given him 7 years. 7 years of hollow safety. 7 years of wondering, why me? The question had been a comfort, a sign that he was a victim of random, tragic chance. But now the answer bloomed in his mind, a black, rotting flower. It wasn't chance, it was a choice. His survival hadn't been a miracle, it had been a courtesy, a kindness. The tapping stopped. A dry, scraping sound began to travel down the door, the sound of a single, gnarled finger tracing a long line in the wood. A sound he had only ever heard once before, in a place of rust and ruin. The radiator in his apartment gave one last, long, sibilant hiss. It sounded, for all the world, like a sigh of satisfaction. The doorknob began to turn.